I'd like to welcome y'all once again to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. This webinar is going to be on managing with multiple species in mind, presented by Mike Marshall, Extension Associate with Texas A&M Institute of Renewable Natural Resources. This month's webinar is made possible through funding provided by San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and is hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Mike, with that, I will pass the controls over to you.
All right, great, thanks. I'll just assume everybody can hear me all right now. And as Clint pointed out, we're going to be talking about managing with multiple species in mind. And you'll notice my title's a bit different. Talks about diversifying income. It's sort of my opinion, and I think many people's opinion, that one important aspect of managing for multi-species, which includes non-game species and game species, is thinking about the bottom line, especially from a producer's point of view. And so there's a lot of different ways I could go about this, and here's kind of the roadmap that we'll be following on this presentation. First of all, since Texas is a privately owned state, as in at least 95% of it is in private ownership, thought it'd be worth talking about the state of private working lands. One of the things our institute does is called Texas Land Trends, and so we'll kind of dive into some stats, some metrics that are population increasing, land use, fragmentation of working lands, and then stepping away from that a little bit, talk a little bit about Leopold's 5 tools, because those kind of provide the backbone of managing a property for wildlife, for water, for just stewardship in general. And then really dig a little bit more into the specifics of the economics. So where is the money coming from in terms of managing for non-game species, for example? What are some of the hidden benefits from an economic perspective for healthy soils, for example? And then what I'd like to do is dig into something that you can find on an extension publication that's available through AgriLife Bookstore, and it's about managing for multi-species and the economics of that. There were a few agencies involved in this publication, Institute for Renewable Natural Resources being one, so me and Brian Hayes, Associate Director authors. We have Texas Parks and Wildlife involved on that. We have NRCS involved in that, so it was a bunch of different agencies coming together to talk about this multi-species management. So I'll focus my talk on that publication and really on grazing management, kind of the relationship between grazing, game, and non-game species, and how those can all be very compatible. And as part of that discussion, we'll kind of look at some case studies. Private land called Rocosa Ridge in Bosque County, and then we'll also talk about it from a public land perspective, looking at the Kerr Wildlife Management Area. So we'll just go ahead and jump right in here. Okay, so when we talk about private lands, and of course we'll be talking about Texas, but if we could scale out a little bit and talk about the United States, about 64% of the entire United States, and obviously most of the eastern half of the United States, is under private ownership. We are losing a lot of private lands, though. If you look at some of the statistics, we're actually losing upwards of an acre of farmland per minute in the United States. So if we kind of zoom into Texas and kind of look at where the people are, who owns the land, and the importance of private lands, you can see that we have 171 million acres in Texas. 142 of that is private rural working lands. So as you can see on the figure on the right here, we're really talking about 1% or even less than 1% of the people that live in Texas owning over 95% of the land. So it's just kind of a different animal in Texas compared to some other states. And so what I'm really trying to say is that if we're going to manage for wildlife and be good stewards of the land, it starts with private lands. And one issue that we have is there's kind of this disconnect, and we see this all over the United States, but it's especially magnified in Texas. We know that privately owned working lands provide things like food, fiber, timber, water, recreation, important to this talk in terms of hunting and fishing. And again, we know that 95% of all Texas is privately owned. However, 90% of the population in Texas lives in urban areas. So you get this real big disconnect, particularly when it comes to policy. So for instance, if 90% of Texans live in urban areas, you know policy is going to be heavily influenced by that 90%. That's not always great for wildlife and natural resources, and so I think it's important, and our institute thinks it's important, that we need to make a case for rural working lands. But one thing, in order to make a case for these rural working lands, to try to bridge that disconnect, is we have to understand the drivers. What's bringing people into the cities? What's causing the fragmentation of the landscape? And so we'll dive into this Texas land trends that I noted earlier. Basically, if I could summarize what Texas land trends really means, is that the state of Texas does not have a demographer. And so this report, if you will, and the data associated with it, it acts as our state's demographer. So what I'm going to do is show you some statistics, things like population increase and market value of the land, and we'll do it on a statewide level. But know that you can yourself, if you'd like, go to the Texas Land Trends website, which I'll provide later, and you can grab things at different scales. So for instance, in your county, in your watershed, river basin. So lots of different scales you can look at this stuff, and it reveals some very interesting patterns, particularly in relation to natural resources. Okay, so what is the data that we use in this Texas Land Trends report? Well, we have 15 years worth of data, and we do this every 5 years. The primary data sets are the County Appraisal District data, and also the USDA Ag Census data. And so really the idea here is we kind of want to look at the relationship between three things: the value of the land, who owns that land, and how is it used. And by looking at those three things, we can kind of start to tease apart and understand some of these challenges that we have when it comes to sustaining these rural working lands, particularly in relation to wildlife management, which we'll get into that as one of those statistics I'll show you for Texas as well. I think these next two slides, which I'm actually going to go back and forth on a couple of times, really highlight or illuminate, if you will, the situation with what's going on in Texas. So right now you see nighttime illumination from 1992. Obviously you see urban areas have a lot of light. That's pretty intuitive. But what I'm going to do is change it to 2012, and I just want you to see what's going on around those cities and around Texas. So we go to 2012, and I'm going to go back and forth a few times, and hopefully that looks okay on you guys' end. You can really see that expansion of the cities. But another thing that you can see, and I'm going to see if I can figure out how to draw a box here, is, and this is just more interesting than anything, okay, is right down in South Texas. Hopefully that green box is showing up. It's kind of an interesting little pop of light down there, and I usually like to ask when I'm talking to a crowd of people, what do you think that is? And you know, maybe some of you have figured it out already, but that's the Eagle Ford Shale. So you can see some similar things going on in the Permian Basin as well. It's just kind of interesting. I always like to point that out to folks. Okay, let's dig into some of these metrics here. So population in Texas. In 1997, remember we're covering a 15-year period here, we went from 19 million to 26 million people. That's a 36% increase. It's pretty astounding, but what I think is even more astounding is when we put numbers to that. That's 500,000 people per year that we're adding to Texas. And what's really interesting is 65% of that increase is occurring within only 10 counties. So obviously it's going to be those counties surrounding the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Austin-San Antonio area, the Houston area, and you see a couple of other spots down there in South Texas and El Paso. And that 65% of the increase occurs within only 4% of the land in Texas. So the next thing I want to talk about is working land loss. So hopefully everyone kind of agrees that privately owned working lands are critical to our livelihood and national security, really. And we're losing it, a lot of it in Texas. So over the last 15 years, we've lost 1 million acres of working lands. So that's an issue. Here's a kind of a complicated slide, and I'll try to sort of summarize it. What we're really looking at here is sort of fragmentation of large working lands. So if you look at the chart in the upper right, you'll see that the purple lines that sort of go in the negative direction, that's where we're losing all of our land. So that's in between that 100-acre to 2,000-acre area. So we've lost a lot of land in that, and it's being fragmented into smaller parcels of land, so subdivision. And you do see some combinations of smaller into larger land holdings that are occurring, say, and some in the Panhandle and in West Texas. But by and large, what's happening is we're fragmenting larger or mid-sized farms and ranches into much smaller ones, which has ramifications for wildlife, for water, for all kinds of natural resource issues. So one thing that could be driving this fragmentation, or probably primarily driving this, is market value. So what you see here are two maps, one's from '97, one's from 2012, and you can see these red hot spots where the average market value per acre is over $5,000 an acre. So you can see that that footprint has expanded greatly into 2012. And so just think about it in this way. At what point does it become worth it for a landowner to hold on to that land when they can make so much more money just by selling it? So that's a challenge that we have when it comes to trying to halt or slow this fragmentation. Just another kind of way to look at it here, to put some numbers to that market value change. We've actually increased, on average across the state, so much higher in certain other areas, 214%. Or over $1,000 an acre, and you can kind of see that trend on that graph in the bottom left. So basically, land value is going up and leads to fragmentation. So we're talking about wildlife, and we also can get at wildlife management. So this, to me, is the silver lining, right? This is that diversifying your income. So if you can farm, ranch, and have wildlife on your property, then it helps you to hang on to that property. So that's really become much more popular in Texas, and we'll talk more about why that might be through a Texas Parks and Wildlife program, but the sheer numbers is that we've gained 3.2 million acres of wildlife management on private property, and that's significant, especially when we started at 92,000 acres only. So landowners are sort of switching their perspective on how to use their land, and you know, we think this is a good thing. So who cares anyways? Just a little note on water. Water is a big topic in Texas right now. This is water quality. You can see that graph on the bottom left. There are more and more and more impaired water bodies every single year. There are over 500 now. Most of them are through bacteria. So I'm going to bring that back later into stewardship. When we apply these stewardship principles on our land, not only are we helping wildlife, but we're helping those impaired water bodies as well. And you can see they're all throughout Texas, but in that small map of Texas in the top right, you can see a lot of these impaired water bodies are clustered around those urban areas. So you can link that back again to sort of that those hot spots that you're seeing where everyone lives. Another reason people care, so I'm from Gatesville, right around Fort Hood, and brush encroachment, not just in Gatesville, but in a lot of areas, is a big deal. And the reason I talk about Gatesville and Fort Hood is this is a imagery actually from the 1930s. This piece of land, I'm going to show you a picture afterwards. This was privately owned at the time, and Fort Hood then basically acquired that land and used it for training purposes. And you'll see that the darker areas are kind of that juniper area, you know, some juniper and hardwoods. Well, fast forward, if I can, there we go. Now, and I'm going to go back and forth a couple of times. Look at those empty areas, and then look how they filled in with that brush there. Well, who cares? That's why. Because when you have brush encroachment, you often have these catastrophic wildfires, of which Fort Hood and the surrounding areas have seen plenty of, which of course has ramifications for wildlife and people. Another who cares anyways, if you haven't heard, there's a lot of species on the way that may be listed under the Endangered Species Act. In fact, over 100 species are petitioned just in Texas right now. And you see I highlighted the Trinity Basin. I could have picked any other river basin, but just for grins decided to include Dallas and some of the areas of Houston. There's about an average of 12 listed species per county within that basin, listed or candidate. And many are aquatic, so again, linking that sort of use of the land to the water. So just something to keep on the radar. Let's bring in some of the wildlife issues. Decline in grassland birds. Grassland birds are some of the most imperiled species on the planet. It's one of the most imperiled biomes on the planet. They include things such as quail, which is one of the more popular game species, and also include some other non-game species that a lot of people like to spend a lot of money watching in the field through ecotourism. And in the background, I mentioned the eagle-fork shale. The energy is a potential game changer. Now, that could be positive or negative. Lots of money in the energy business that can be diverted into natural resources, but, also has a potential game-changing outcome on the land itself. So, again, just highlighting the Trinity Basin, in the last 15 years, we've seen a 716% increase in the number of oil and gas leases, which has led to $11.3 billion increase in the market value of those areas. So kind of all this going on, just want to throw a bunch of stats at you before we jumped into actually managing properties themselves. So with all this in mind, how do we avoid that, the for sale sign? Well, some ideas here which we'll dig into are voluntary protection and stewardship, of course. So we'll dig in a little bit to these programs like 1D1, managing basically tax valuation for your property for wildlife use. There are many market-driven programs, and Aldo Leopold's 5 management tools. And let's jump into a few of those. Here's the extension publication I referenced earlier that we'll be focusing on for much of the rest of this presentation, and it's also the title of this presentation itself. So when we talk about private land stewardship, a lot of people throw around the term stewardship, and there are a lot of definitions. None of them are particularly right or wrong, but I thought this was a pretty good one for specifically private land stewardship. And I'll just read it out here. It's the process of synthesizing land management practices, principles, and values in a balanced approach to secure the long-term health and sustainability of private lands. And so it really kind of takes into account 3 main things. So like when I say biotic community, integrity, and stability, I'm talking about the soil, the plants, the animals, the water. And then layered into that, when you think about it from a private lands perspective, are landowner interests, very important, and the community well-being. They're producing these food, fiber, timber, and recreation. So where those 3 things intersect, we think that that's sort of where private land stewardship exists. Aldo Leopold's 5 tools, you guys may have heard this before. Aldo Leopold was pretty much the father of wildlife and game management, and a lot of what we do as wildlife biologists. And one of his famous quotes that you'll see come up later when we talk about the Kerr wildlife management area is that game, and in this case non-game as well, can be restored by the creative use of the same tools which have heretofore destroyed it: the axe, fire, gun, plow, and cow. So the axe during his time was probably literally an axe, but nowadays we have a lot of different versions of an axe. So we have sort of skid steers, we have herbicides, we have all kinds of different ways that we can manipulate vegetation, and doing that in an appropriate, smart, strategic fashion can be great for wildlife and also great for water quality and all other kinds of natural resource issues. Fire, very big deal. So we've changed the way fire acts on the landscape. Now, I show an Oklahoma prescribed burn association because I just grabbed a quick picture, but Texas has a lot of prescribed burn associations, people that are interested in putting fire on the landscape in a controlled fashion to promote native vegetation, to knock brush back, and it's one of the more effective and cheaper ways to manage your property for wildlife, and we'll get into some specific wildlife later. The gun, 2 different ways to look at it from my perspective. The gun can literally control populations in an efficient way. Sometimes we have deer overpopulation issues, and the gun is a very good way to take care of that. Another way to look at the gun is the money that comes in because of hunting. So we'll get into some of the economics of that, but a lot of money goes into these rural economies when hunting season opens. And that's a really important thing from the perspective of keeping those working lands and private land ownership. The plow. So in some ways, I'm not literally talking about a plow now, but there's this whole idea of soil health, and we'll get into the economics of that as well. Sometimes people are putting herbicides and pesticides on the ground, particularly herbicides, when they don't need to. Simple soil test, simple principles of soil health can really save money and be great for the landscape, can be conducive for wildlife habitat, and also good for water quality. And finally, the cow. So this is an interesting one. Some people think that cows just don't fit into a wildlife management perspective, but in a sense, a cow can be anything. It could be a goat, it could be a cow. Let's just talk about livestock. Grazing is a natural part of the system. Overgrazing is bad. No grazing is bad too. And you can see that sort of complicated graph on the top left. There's an optimum range for the amount of grazing that a landscape should see, and we will get into that when we talk about grazing management. So let's talk dollars and cents here for just a second, and we'll hit on some economics of these stewardship principles. First, hunting and fishing, then we'll get into some of the non-game stuff, talk a little bit about some assistance programs, wildlife tax valuation, and then I like to kind of end with the healthy soil conversation and sort of how much money that hidden costs that are in that. So just some numbers, and this is for Texas, and this is a little bit old. I believe this is from 2011, but I'm sure the numbers are fairly close still. Over $6.2 billion is spent in Texas on wildlife recreation per year. Now, I wouldn't mind being corrected on that, but we'll just say billions of dollars. And over 1 million hunters spend over $1.8 billion. 2.25 fishermen spend over $1 billion. And if you look at those underneath each of those bullets, between 46 to 68% of that is spent basically in those destination counties, often rural counties. That's helping those rural farmers, ranchers, and generally kind of bridging that disconnect that we talked about a little bit earlier. Quail are a great example. There's another really good publication out there, extension publication, about managing for quail and IDing habitat, and it talks a little bit about how much a hunter brings in. Over $10,000 the average hunter spends on quail hunting per year. It's a lot of money, and a majority of that, again, is spent in those destination counties on things like lodging, fuel, food, leases, those kinds of things. So we certainly like to welcome back those hunters as they're putting money into rural economies. And then kind of bringing in from the publication about multi-species game management. So if you look at, again, you can pull out statistics from anywhere, but these are some of the numbers I found. Farm and Ranch Guide says, on average, profit about $200 head of cattle. So if you assume a stocking rate of 1 cow to 20 acres, you basically, at the end of the day, say a cow offers you $10 per acre per year. Okay, and then you can look at a lot of other sources on economics of a deer lease. That varies quite a bit, but let's, a nice average would be about as much as $15 per acre. So this isn't an either or scenario. This is a both. You can have deer, you can have cow, and then you can also have non-game. So remember, the cow is one of Leopold's 5 tools, and they're compatible. So why not have that $25 per acre per year by managing your property effectively? Ecotourism, a lot of people don't know this, but it's one of the fastest growing tourism markets, not just nationally and not in the world, but in Texas specifically. So if you look at growth rates for ecotourism, it's anywhere between 10 to 30%, where it's just 4% for general tourism. So people are really liking to get out there and watch wildlife, game, non-game, you name it. So 25% of Texans are involved with some kind of wildlife watching. Tourism is the 3rd largest industry in Texas, and ecotourism makes up a significant share of that. And these migratory birds are particularly important in terms of what people are going to look at. So Texas is actually the #1 bird watching state or province in North America. And it has the #2 bird watching destination in all of North America, the Valley. So people are coming from all over the place to see these birds, and they're spending a lot of money to do it. Switching gears a little bit, they're the typical programs that many of you know of, and I've only thrown up a handful of agencies here, but they all offer some kind of financial and or technical assistance. Of course, you have the USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service. You have Texas GLC, which is Grazing Lands Coalition. You have Fish and Wildlife Service has programs, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, Forest Service, AgriLife Extension Service. All these people can help, and a lot of them offer money to manage your property. I wanted to hit one slide on this because this could literally be an entire talk, and Texas Parks and Wildlife would be much more qualified to talk about this, but I wanted to mention that it's becoming more popular to manage your property for wildlife, and this is not a tax exemption. It is just that you are getting that, rather than managing your property for ag, say, for instance, you're just switching it to wildlife, you get that same benefit. There's always been a lot of confusion about that. And really what you need to have is a wildlife management plan. And the really cool thing about this is you can come up with that management plan yourself. I would suggest getting with Texas Parks and Wildlife or any of those other agencies to help write that up. But you can really tailor make it to your property. And it has to include 3 of the following practices. And a lot of these are things that people are doing already or be pretty simple to go ahead and include in the way you manage your property. Habitat, erosion, predator control, putting supplemental water or food out, providing shelters, counting, say for instance deer. And if you really want to dig into this stuff, either get a hold of Texas Parks and Wildlife, or I've provided a link down at the bottom here. And what you can do is just type in Wildlife Tax Valuation Texas Comptroller, and you'll find this, and it kind of spells out the legal whenever this thing was passed through. So just wanted to mention that that's a really good option. Here's the other kind of hidden cost with healthy soils. So yeah, again, can do an entire talk on soil health and the 5 principles. The idea is making sure there's always some kind of armor like grass cover or something on your soil, minimizing disturbance, not taking disturbance out, but minimizing it, having a diversity of native plants on the ground, keeping those plants on the ground year-round so you have a living root. And then the 5th one, interestingly enough, is integrating livestock, and is a very important part of it. The reason I put this up for economics is, and it's probably pretty difficult to see this, the numbers on there, but there have been various universities that kind of have estimated how much money you could make or save by increasing your soil organic matter in 1 acre. So, for example, one study showed that just inputs like carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, you can save upwards of $832 in an acre furrow slice. And just from a water perspective too, not even economics, 1% increase in organic matter in 6 inches of soil can hold up to 19,000 gallons of water. So keeping care of your soils is critical for the plants and the animals that depend on those plants. Okay, we're really going to focus in on some case studies and some specific species here to kind of finish out the presentation. And this is going to be focused on the Texas Hill Country and really revolves around 3 species, if you will. The black-capped vireo, which is a non-game migratory bird that is endangered. We have a white-tailed deer, which I'm sure everybody knows here, very popular game species. And then we have the cow. Now you notice a little blank space down here. Well, I'm going to try to put the quail in here. The quail isn't included in the paper, but I think that these 4 species can easily be managed for on a property because they have very, very similar requirements. Start with the black-capped vireo. Those of you that aren't familiar with this bird, it's a little teeny bird. It was listed as endangered in 1987. There's a saying around Fort Hood that I've heard multiple times, and this was because it was endangered. There are lots of programs that provide cost assistance for managing for these things. So some of the people around there would say there's more money in birds than there is in cows. And so again, I'd come back and say, well, why not both? So just a little something about them. They were listed as endangered because of habitat loss. This is very typical. And also something called a brown-headed cowbird, which if you hadn't heard of this thing, it's kind of an interesting creature. What it does is it lays its eggs in another bird's nest, and those birds often don't recognize that. So let's say, for instance, a vireo lays 3 eggs, and a cowbird drops another one in there. Well, the bird will sit on all those eggs, and that cowbird will hatch first and basically kill the rest of the birds, and the vireo will raise that cowbird as its own. So basically it did not successfully breed. So it's a pretty terrible thing. Cowbirds are natural, but when we switched from buffalo roaming the landscape to cows being confined in the spaces, the cowbirds got worse. So it's something that we have to manage for with vireo. I'm not going to say much about white-tailed deer. I think we've all seen them. I think we're all familiar with them. They're very common, broadly distributed, very popular game species that brings in a lot of money to rural economies. Now I'm going to talk about the habitat of those two. So the picture on the left would be what you would find in the hill country or the cross timbers. Very typical, so that kind of brushy type stuff. So you want brush from about the ground up to about 6 feet. I like to say it's a doorknob height thing. So if you kind of put your hand out like you're going to open a doorknob and there's some brush right there, and heavy brush, that's exactly what they like, because that's where they're going to put their nest and conceal it. And about 30 to 60% of the area should be in brush in order to be habitat. And the stable versus disturbance, the only reason I bring that up is there are vireo in South and Western Texas where their habitat is actually as high as that stuff's going to grow. So in Central Texas, you want fire, you want brush management, you need disturbance to keep that stuff short. You don't want it much taller than 6 feet. Whereas in West Texas, you know, you may not want to run a fire through there because it's great habitat and won't grow out of that. Not going to get too much into this. We mentioned the cowbirds. So rather than just managing for habitat, you have to consider these nasty little birds here, and there are various ways you can manage for them. You know, simple things like don't spill and scatter your grain all over the place because that's where they congregate. Some things you can do with grazing management. Definitely shooting birds are fine. They're a nuisance. They can be shot. Cowbird trapping is probably one of the most effective techniques. You need to actually get certified to do it. I've been certified several times. It's very easy. The reason you have to be certified is if you put up a cowbird trap and you catch, and you will catch, other species like cardinals and whatnot, they just, you know, need you to know to be able to identify the birds and not, you know, kill these other birds, basically. So more information on that, just Google cowbird trapping, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and it's pretty simple, and they can give you more information on that. Okay, white-tailed deer habitat. I don't know if you've noticed by looking at this picture, but it looks an awful lot like black-cap vireo habitat, which is exactly the point. So basically clearings that are dominated by forbs and grasses, or like weeds and grasses, basically. And you want it kind of interspersed with brush all over the place. So brush management really is kind of a balancing act here, right? You don't want too much of it to hinder their movement, but you want just enough of it though for concealment purposes and in terms of the vireo being able to place a nest. A little bit more about deer and vireo and how they kind of overlap in their needs are actually the species of plant itself. So, for example, the chart on the right here kind of gives an idea, and I believe this is from the Cross Timbers region because it's going to vary depending on where you are, but kind of gives you an idea of what's really good forage for deer versus okay forage for deer. So, for example, Texas oak is a class 1, so is Carolina buckthorn. Those are very highly preferred. And some of the ones with asterisks on them, you know, it may be a 4, which means least preferred, but they'll have some kind of mast or acorns that they'll eat seasonally. So my point is, if you look over at the pictures of the vireos, what you see there is Texas oak. That is a Vireo nest in Texas oak. And then you see a Vireo in the Texas persimmon. So if we look over here, Texas oak is a highly preferred plant for deer, and it's also going to provide some nesting habitat for Vireo. Persimmon, that's a class 4, so it says it's least preferred, but you see the asterisks during the season when those persimmons fall, they're going to be great for deer. So just kind of showing you not just the canopy cover, but the actual species of plant, there's a lot of overlap. We'll talk more about this later. Grazing practices are very important when thinking about white-tailed deer, especially in terms of their cover types. You know, they need different cover types: escape, loafing, and fawning. And a real big point here is food preference. So, you know, there have been a lot of studies on food preference for deer and for cattle, and the bottom line is deer prefer brush and forbs and cattle prefer grass. So that's great, right? You get the cattle grazing the grass, the deer eating brush and forbs, and you keep enough of it for the Vireo. You've got a great situation. And that's going to have a lot to do with your stocking rates and the way you rotate your cattle, which we'll really get into here in just a minute. I mentioned quail earlier. Here's that extension pub I wanted to highlight. One of the lines from it talks about habitat, and it says mott's, strips, or blocks of low-growing dense brush that make up 5 to 30% of the area to provide escaping and loafing. Well, I can tell you that I've seen some bobwhite, and I've seen Vireo, and I've looked at their habitat, and I know anything between 25 to 40% for sure can easily support those 3 species, and you can use cattle as a tool to get you to that point. When we talk about cover, I just wanted to make a real quick note here. If you look at the boxes labeled 1, 2, 3, I mean, there's maybe each one of those boxes has the same amount of cover, but the way it's interspersed is very important. So, for example, box 3 would be more what I'd be looking for from a wildlife perspective. You've got those clusters of shrubs that give you habitat for the birds, and you've got that grass in between that's good for the quail. So just kind of a note on that. And also, it matters how tall stuff is. You see this guy with the big measuring stick and that tall mesquite. Well, Vireo don't actually use mesquite, and so from the perspective of cover, that's kind of useless cover for a black-cap Vireo. Grazing management. We'll try to speed up a little bit on this stuff. It's one of the few things under the manager's control. It's about where, when, how much, and how often you graze your livestock. And stocking rate, which is what we're going to focus on, is very important and requires 2 things: production and demand. Again, it's key. Rotational grazing is useless if you're out of grass, basically. I mean, so the bottom line is about tracking how much grass you have, and it's going to be about something called take half, leave half. You don't want to graze more than half the grass. And here's that take half, leave half. So in a sense, grasses produce about 200% of what they need to sustain themselves. But when we say half, it doesn't mean graze half. And why is that? Well, 25% of that's going to be consumed by the cow. 25% of that's going to be lost to things like grasshoppers. You guys seen a few of those in the last couple of years. And then you leave 50% for the resource. So what does that mean, 50% for the resource? Look at that picture at the top right. You see the far left root system there, that's ungrazed. Look at the next one over to the right, that's 50% grazed. You barely lose any root growth. If you go just under that take half, leave half, all of a sudden you've lost all kinds of root growth. You're going to have issues with water filtrating through that soil. So that's kind of the visual of why we say take half, leave half. So remember that 25% harvest efficiency. So monitoring the forage is important. There's been a survey that indicates less than 15 to 20% of people actually go out and monitor their grass. So how do you do it? There's really good YouTube videos that you can go and look at this later, and I'll try to maybe post a link to that or something later if I get an opportunity. But if you just Google stocking rate, wildlife and fisheries science, there's a good YouTube on this. So you start by getting a yardstick and you lay out basically a square grid, and then you clip the grass down to the ground. You let it air dry. A couple ways you can do that. A real good way is just to put it in a paper bag and leave it on the hood of your truck for a couple of days during a hot day, or you can microwave it. Then you weigh the forage in grams. So you need a gram scale. That's about gram scale and a yardstick's all you really need. So you get that weight, you multiply it by 10.7, and here's an example. You air dried it, got 200 grams, multiply that by 10.7, that gives you your pounds per acre, 2,140 pounds per acre. Here's some visuals of kind of what it looks like. There's a probably overgrazed situation here, 600 pounds per acre. There's what 1,000 pounds per acre looks like, 2 and 3, so you kind of get a visual of what this looks like. So why is this important? Well, you kind of look on this here and you can see on the right, it's a little less than on the left here. You got 30 pounds versus 39 pounds. Well, on the same graphs that you can run 1,300 pound cows, you can run 130,000 pound cows, and that can make all the difference in the world. So animal demand's the other thing you have to take into account, right? So when we talk about cows, I mean, I'm focusing on cows here, but there are ways you can come up with these, what you call animal units for things like goats and horses and whatnot. But if we're talking about cows, the way they make an animal unit is one 1,000 pound cow, and they do some fancy math and come up with this number, 9,490 pounds of forage per animal per year. So we know what a cow needs and we know what we got, so we can figure out our stocking rate. So in our example, let's say take 2,000 pounds per acre. Remember, we want that 25% harvest efficiency. It's not take half, leave half, it's really take quarter. So 500 pounds per acre is available for those cows to graze on. And if you divide your animal demand by what you have available, in this example, you have 19 acres per animal unit. So 1 cow to 19 acres. And then this is where most people stop. But we're not done. You have to adjust for grazable acres. Not every single part of your ranch or your land is grazable. You got to take into account topography, brush, roads, headquarters. So you really need to take your property in consideration, but it's kind of safe in some examples say about 70% of the property is grazable. So in the example we use, you want to adjust that 19 acres per animal unit to 27.1. So then you got yourself a good stocking rate. Here's some examples of what I would consider to be ungrazable acres, steep slopes and heavy brush. Again, there's another example where not everything's grazable there. Roads are interesting, a lot of times not taken account for. 1 mile of 20-foot road is equal to 2.4 surface acres. So you got to take that stuff into account. So I think this is a good word to the wise. If your cow plies stack up taller than your grass, you have a grazing management problem. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with 2 case studies, and I ought to be done here in about 5 minutes. So Kerr Wildlife Management Area, great place. If you never visited there, it was purchased in 1950. It covers about 6,500 acres in Hunt, Texas. And the 5 tools are really the backbone of what they do, Aldo Leopold's 5 tools. If you go there and visit, you will see the 5 tools everywhere. They've got literature on it, and it's what they run their operation under, and it's a great thing. So when they bought this place, overgrazing and fire suppression had led to a bunch of ash juniper. So they had deer there, but they were incredibly overpopulated, massive die-offs, lots of juniper, not a lot of native grass. So they started managing the property, and so by 1966, they shifted from this whole continuous grazing system with cattle. They strategically removed juniper and white-tailed deer by either sex public hunts, and what resulted eventually was a very diverse plant system. Now, with that diverse plant system actually came some issues. It led to an increase of native deer and exotics going to basically the best restaurant on the block. So in 1968, they erected an 8-foot fence, and the reason was to keep the deer off of their property, not to necessarily keep them on theirs. So they currently, and I don't know if anyone from Texas Parks and Wildlife is on here, they can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least a couple of years ago, they held about a deer to every 10 to 12 acres. So some of the graphs that kind of show the results of their management, in particular with deer, you can see the percent fawn crop has varied year by year, but is going up. And you can see that dashed line shows when they put in that game-proof fence. So their percent fawn crop's looking good and got a lot better since purchase. Field dress weight on 4.5-year bucks, so these older bucks, they're getting bigger. So you've got bigger, healthier deer producing more fawns. Grazing management, I want to dig a little bit into that. Since 1984, their system has been 25 pastures, short duration, long rest. So they like to hit it hard and let it rest. And then they have one herd that's rotated every 90 to 120 days, but they stay flexible with that. So that's critical too. I didn't hit on that enough with your grazing management. You've always got to be flexible. Different years are going to bring different amounts of precipitation. And the shipping weights per calf, the average was over 500 pounds. And this graph down at the left just kind of shows you through time the different systems that they implemented and how they sort of learned lessons and are now on that short duration system, and those calf weights have just gone up and up and up. And that only goes to 1994. The Vireo, they have lots of Vireo there. The reason they do is they implement prescribed fire. They remove a lot of the juniper and let some of those hardwoods grow in. Cattle rotation, they're not overpopulated with deer, so they're not eating all the good plants that Vireo nest in. They've reduced some of the brush down to that 30 to 60% range, and they trap cowbirds all the time, March through May. Here's a look at what's happening with the Vireo. On the right here, you see the dots where they've actually surveyed and herd birds. And you can see from 1986 to 2013, just look at that increase in the number of Vireos. I mean, you can tell they've reached some kind of threshold at this point where they've pretty much holding all the birds they can. And it's a lot of them. It's nearly 500 birds. Switching gears to private lands, the way to look at it is like, okay, it's one thing when a public property is managed and, you know, they have these resources and whatnot, but what about private land? Is this actually happening somewhere on private land? Well, I can tell you there is, and the guy Bruce Berg is one of the best private land stewards I've ever met. He has approximately the same size area, about a 6,000 acre ranch in Bosque County, and when he purchased it, there was two units, a north and a south, just kind of the way it was laid out. And the north unit, and they were managed differently. So the north unit was a quarter horse operation, and it was, from the perspective of grazing, was underutilized. So probably not enough grazing. And the south unit was the complete opposite, heavily grazed, juniper encroachment. Think of the Kerr wildlife management area, same kind of situation. So the management of his ranch was primarily through grazing. So he set very conservative stocking rates, he rotationally grazed them, set himself up with 17 pastures, put in 12 miles of fence, 13 miles of water lines, and then he uses sacrifice areas, which I think is brilliant. So when times are tough, I mean, he has to put them in areas where he knows he's just going to beat up that area, but you have a sacrifice area set off to the side so you can manage your property properly across the rest of it. Prescribed fire, heavily utilized on this property. In fact, it was conducted on all but 150 acres over a 3-year period. So, I mean, that just jump-started the process. Got those seeds out of that seed bank. 800 acres of juniper were grubbed on moderate slopes, so not the real heavy slopes, just moderate ones. One of the reasons for not taking some of the ones off on the moderate slopes is A, it's too expensive, and there's another bird called the golden-cheeked warbler that exists on those hillsides and that juniper oak kind of hill country looking stuff, and that's an endangered species that he was also interested in managing for as well, and did so successfully. Deer management, he has gone 1 deer to 8 acres to 1 deer to 15 acres. He utilizes MLDP permits, which allows him some flexibility through Texas Parks and Wildlife to have an extended hunting season. If you want more information on that, again, I would just Google MLDP plus Texas Parks and Wildlife. It's a really great program that helps you kind of make the most out of your deer management. And he also did the same thing as Kerr Wildlife Management Area in that he used a high fence to exclude deer because, you know, again, he became the best restaurant on the block. Results of his management, native prairie grasses have increased. I mean, I've been out there several times. There's Indian grass, little blue stem, big blue stem, all the big grasses you want are out there. While the canyons and the draws maintain that brush, that things like the golden-cheeked warbler on the left, the black-cap vireo, He's got lots of those. He's got quail everywhere. So he's basically an example of what we're looking for in terms of a private land steward. If you want to see more about him, there's actually an episode of Out on the Land. You can Google Out on the Land, and you can go to their website and watch Season 3, Episode 38. It's about a 20-minute episode that highlights all the things that he did on his land. He kind of talks about how he gets involved in it. I mean, he took a prescribed fire class so he can burn. He's a great land steward, and I'd suggest watching that episode if you're kind of interested in that particular story. And all the other episodes are great too. And I believe this is going to be my second to last slide. I kind of put this in here not too long ago. This is a great website for if you are interested in managing your land for wildlife and you just need some resources at your fingertips. So for instance, how can you manage for a particular species you want to manage for? Where can you do it? In terms of their interactive maps that can show your property in terms of where habitat may be available. So I would recommend visiting Conservation Framework. Just Google that or do Conservationframework.tamu.edu and just, have a look around and see if there's anything that might interest you on there. With that, this is my last slide that has my contact info. The irnr.tamu.edu is the institute that I work for, and the TexasLandTrends.org is a website you can go to get some reports and also grab data if you care to. In relation to some of the population and land and market values. So I am all finished up. So I guess at this point I can take questions if anybody has them, and I will see if I can come up with an answer.